Hey y'all, this is Brown at I Have Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about Salem's Lot on Blu-ray. So Salem's Lot was a 3-hour miniseries that premiered on network television in 1979, and it was the first adaptation of the 1975 horror novel by Stephen King of the same name. So the Stephen King novel Salem's Lot has gone to be regarded as one of his best works, and as far as an example of vampire literature, it's been regarded as a classic of the field. And so, I mean, Salem's Lot is just an all-around great piece of horror fiction, and it's a classic of the genre. So if you're a horror fan and if you haven't checked out Salem's Lot yet, and if you or even say if you're a vampire fan and you haven't checked out Salem's Lot, I would definitely recommend giving it a shot, because it's a wonderful horror novel. But the miniseries, though, was something that I saw after reading the novel. And I remember the novel made such an impression on me, because even though it was written in 1975 and I was reading it in the early 2000s, just the fact that Stephen King was such a good writer that he was able to give life to all the citizens of the small town of Salem's Lot, and it made it really feel like a small town. I mean, or let me phrase that. You felt like you were reading about the people in a small town, and their day-to-day activities, and also their underlying darkness, because it turns out a lot of people in the town had some twisted skeletons in the closet. And so even if nothing supernatural had been introduced, I mean, it would probably be a good dark drama, because on the surface, Salem's Lot is a picturesque small town suburbia, right? But then but then you have all these people hiding all these secrets and everything. And so then you realize that, oh, this town isn't as um, charming as it appears to be on the surface, that kind of thing. But you bring in vampires, though, and you have a rather unique set of circumstances to make it to where you have a novel that if I remember correctly, was the first time that any writer had vampires coming from Europe to America, as opposed to, say, having people from America going to Europe and finding the vampires there. Because a lot of stories at the time and movies had it happen where the main characters, whether they be American or European, would have to go to some ominous part of Europe, usually in the mountains, and find a castle, and then you find the vampires, and so basically this was kind of the opposite. The vampires came down from the mountains and into small town America. And I want to say that was the first time that that had been depicted in a novel at the time. And so that's one of the reasons why Salem's Lot stood out so much, because no one had seen anything like that before. So with the miniseries, the first time I saw it, it was on it was on a double VHS tape set. And because this was, I don't remember if it was my mom who let me borrow it, or if I had gotten it from Blockbuster. But either way, I saw it on VHS, and it was in two tapes, because it was a 3-hour miniseries in two parts. But I remember, I mean, I thought it was well done for the time, but I was kind of disappointed in it, because some of the stuff that I liked in the book, they unfortunately left out of the miniseries. But as time has gone on, though, I've come back to the miniseries, time and again, and I've come to, respect it as its own thing. And, even if, say, it's missing, some of my, favorite parts from the book, it's still, a good piece of, vampire horror. And, considering that this is, something that was on mainstream television in 1979, it's still pretty creepy. So, when it comes to who directed it, we have Mr. Tobe Hooper, and this was his third project, to work on it, if I remember correctly, because, the first film he did was that lightning in a bottle, horror masterpiece, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 1974. And then he did the less successful and less well received Eaten Alive, which in my opinion wasn't that good of a movie. But I mean, there's some fascinating behind the scenes stuff about the movie, but just the movie honestly wasn't that good. And depending on who you talk to, Tobe Hooper either quit a good portion of the way through production, or he was fired, one of the two. So Eaten Alive, he didn't direct all of it. But so when he was going to be doing his third theatrical film, it was going to be a horror movie called The Dark. And that is a movie that, the behind the scenes stuff about The Dark is, by all accounts, far more interesting than the actual movie, because The Dark, as Tobe Hooper was originally going to be, directing it, was going to be, telling the story of, this guy who had been, kept in his bedroom, by his parents, like basically held prisoner, ever since he was a child, because he was autistic, and his parents, they were horribly abusive towards him, and they, take out their frustrations on him and torture him and stuff like that. And so you have this poor kid, growing to adulthood, literally in his bedroom, throughout his whole life. But then one day the house burns down, and the parents, with the house, but somehow, this, young man survives. But, even though he's, free, in the outside world for the first time, he has a lot of anger. And basically, because of his autistic, mental nature, I mean, his, perspective on things is more than a little unbalanced. And so basically the whole idea was, you'd have like a slasher movie, but, with something of, a tragic backstory for the antagonist. And so, as it was originally presented, I mean, that sounded like it would have been an interesting horror film. And that was the movie that Tobe Hooper was wanting to make. But unfortunately, though, he butt heads with a lot of the studio executives. And what happened was, this was 1979, and Ridley Scott's Alien had come out. And so Alien was a perfect, hybrid of science fiction and horror. And so when the executives who were in charge of, producing The Dark saw that, Alien was a smash hit, they wanted to basically redo the movie and, do it as, basically, a sci-fi horror film. Like they were wanting to, basically do away with, the original idea, and they're just going to wanting to have this guy somehow be connected to aliens and going around zapping people with, these eye beams. And, Tobe Hooper, if I remember correctly, he had already shot some footage for the movie, but I think it was like a week into filming, they fired him. And so this other guy, I don't remember his name, came in and took over, and they basically, redid the whole film, to where it's like, you have these, drawn in, laser blasts coming from, the killer's eyes, and he's, just blowing people up with these eye beams now. So Tobe Hooper was fired from The Dark, which was going to be his third movie, but, since he was fired from that, that freed him up to, be available for something else. And so, one of the people that was involved in producing Salem's Lot, the miniseries, happened to catch a screening of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and they're like, okay, we want this guy to do our miniseries. And so that's how Tobe Hooper came to be involved in directing Salem's Lot. And, by most people's, accounts, I mean, or according to like a lot of people who have seen a good portion of Tobe Hooper's work, I mean, Salem's Lot's definitely one of his best, and I'm inclined to agree. But it also showed that, Tobe Hooper could, work within the realm of mainstream, entertainment. Even though this is still a horror movie, there is a mainstream sensibility to it where, even if you're not a horror fan, you can appreciate and relate to it, in some ways. So yeah, I mean, originally though, the miniseries was not going to be a miniseries. It was going to be a feature-length movie adaptation, and a whole bunch of people, like directors and writers, were wanted to take a shot at directing Salem's Lot, the movie, right? And Stephen King, in all these interviews, he was talking about how so many people who were a part of the horror genre, like as far as directors and writers, wanted to be involved with Salem's Lot. And, considering that, his, the Brian De Palma adaptation of his novel Carrie was such a success, I mean, people were like, hey, Salem's Lot, I mean, it's a happening thing. Let's do this. But unfortunately, no one was really able to come up with something that, would do the novel justice while at the same time being a good movie. And there was even a point where the screenwriter and B-movie director Larry Cohen had taken a shot at doing a screenplay. But, basically the studio, didn't like the screenplay, and so they didn't use it, right? But it wasn't until, the movie changed hands and Warner Brothers got involved, that they brought in a producer, a guy by the name of Richard Kobritz, and he's the gentleman who came up with the idea of, instead of doing Salem's Lot as a doing Salem's Lot as a movie, do it as a mini-series, because trying to, do justice to, such a complex horror novel, wouldn't work if you tried to do it as just a movie. So that's where, that's how they came to make Salem's Lot as a mini-series. And so to do the screenplay, they brought in a guy named Paul Monash, and he had actually been one of the producers on the Brian De Palma film Carrie, which was the first adaptation of a Stephen King work. But and also he was known for being able to write stories involving small towns, and so he did the screenplay based on Stephen King's novel. And so as a result, what we get is a well-cast miniseries that, even if it leaves some of the stuff from the novel out, it definitely does the novel justice, and it stands out as being its own, entity, so to speak. But even to this day, though, the casting in this movie was very inspired, and a lot of people, I mean, they look back on it fondly, and like, especially if you are familiar with certain actors that were prominent in the 70s. I mean, you could definitely pick them out in this movie. And there are even a couple of people that went on to have a career beyond the 70s that show up here. So So yeah, I mean, I actually thought that this was a cool miniseries, and as I've gotten older, I've come to appreciate it more. And I definitely think that this is one of Tobe Hooper's best works. So, and as far as Stephen King adaptations go, it's pretty good. So let's go ahead and get into the story. So it takes place in a small town of Salem's Lot, which is somewhere in Maine. And the focus, for the most part, is on a writer named Ben Mears, as played by David Soul. And he comes to Salem's Lot because, while he is a successful writer, he's had a personal tragedy wherein his wife died, and he was the only survivor, and so there's kind of like a bit of survivor guilt on his part, and also people in his neck of the woods were kind of suspicious of him, like how come your wife died but you didn't, that kind of thing. And so he just wanted to get away from it all and try and I guess rebuild himself, so to speak, like creatively speaking. And so he comes back to his old hometown of Salem's Lot to sort of get the creative juices flowing, and also trying to give himself a break from the tragedy. But at the same time, though, that he comes in, a gentleman named Barlow. Let's see, give me a sec. Sorry, Straker. Richard Straker, as played by the late great James Mason, makes his entrance into town, and he's a European gentleman, very refined, very cultured individual, and he buys this house called the Marston House, which is kind of an infamous spot in the town of Salem's Lot, because it's a house that's reputedly haunted, and a lot of people had died there in a tragic murder suicide. And so Ben Mears was actually wanting to rent the house because he was wanting to find a way to tap into this darkness that's within him, that's coming from all the grief that he's experienced from losing his wife. And so he remembered some horrific stories he'd heard about the Marston house, and also he remembers when he was a kid something spooky that he saw, and he's thinking, hey, if I can rent that place, I mean, it'll be perfect. I can channel all this darkness into something productive. But when he finds out that it's already being rented by Straker, I mean, he settles for renting a room at a sort of like a bed and breakfast place in the town. But in the meantime, though, Straker makes arrangements to have a certain piece of furniture, a quote-unquote headboard, brought into the town of Salem's Lot and brought into the basement of the Marsden house. But little do any of the townspeople know that Straker is in partnership with an ancient vampire named Barlow, and this quote-unquote headboard was in fact Barlow's coffin that had been brought from Europe to America. And so now, since it's been delivered to the Marston house, to the basement of the Marston house, Straker works to pave the way, or to clear the way for his vampiric master to be able to have a foothold on the town. And so as time goes on, on one hand you have Ben Mears forming a relationship with a local named Susan Norton, as played by Bonnie Bedelia. And the two of them become an item. And it's interesting because, I mean, her father, a guy named, let's see, give me a sec. Sorry, I got to consult my notes. There's some people to keep track of. Her father, the town doctor, by the name of Dr. Bill Norton, as played by Ed Flanders, he likes Ben Mears, and he gets a feel for the guy, and comes away with the conclusion that, I mean, the guy's had some tragedy in his life, but he's a good dude, so he's supportive of Ben courting his daughter and having her something going with her. But Susan's mother, not so much. She's very overbearing, very overprotective. So there's a little bit of of a difference of opinion there. But Susan and Ben are nonetheless able to have a relationship with one another. So that is one of the bright spots of the story. And also, there's a young boy named Mark Petrie, played by Lance Kerwin, who is, I mean, not an outcast by any means, but he is a kid who, while he's very studious and very committed to his schoolwork and everything, his interests lay in the realm of horror fiction. Because he likes to make horror models, masks, and things like that. And his parents, they're kind of like, oh, when are you going to outgrow all this stuff? But thing is, Ben's, I'm sorry, Mark Petrie's fascination with horror comes in handy, in the sense that, once this vampire outbreak starts to spread through the town, Mark Petrie is one of the few people who's able to, have an idea of how to survive against it and confront it. So, one of the other people that the story focuses on is a guy named, let's see, give me a moment. Jason Burke. And so Jason Burke was played by this old-time actor named Lou Ayres, but Jason Burke was Ben's one of his old teachers. And so when Ben finds out that, when Ben finds out that Jason is still teaching in town or still working as a teacher, he reconnects with him, and the two of them, they rekindle, their friendship, and because there's like a student-teacher friendship, but then they kind of see each other as friends and colleagues because they both work in the literary field, and so there's this fascinating conversation that the two of them have about whether or not they believe that, an object such as, say, a house, just a man-made house, can be inherently evil. And so there's some discussion about that because there's been so much tragedy associated with the house. And also, they touch on the, fact that, some strange stuff started happening, once, Straker came into town and rented it. And so even though Straker is making a point to be cordial to the people of the town when he has to interact with them, he's even setting up an antique shop called Barlow and Straker, or Barlow and Straker's Antiques or something like that. And so when people are asking him, like, when are we going to meet Mr. Barlow? And he says, oh, he'll be, coming, to this town quite soon, I assure you. And, some people are all like, oh, we'd love to meet him. And he says, and he would enjoy meeting you too. But of course, people don't know that Barlow's a vampire and Straker's his familiar. But, so you have this, group of characters that, you see them getting to know each other, and work together. But then you also have, this gradual vampire outbreak because, once Straker comes in, you have, people who are go missing, and then, they come back, but, at the point of death, so basically they've been fed upon by a vampire. And, this vampire outbreak, starts to spread throughout the town. And, one guy who's, trying to keep some form of order in the town, is Constable Parkins Gillespie, played by Kenneth McMillan. And to give him credit, he actually does, try to, investigate things as far as, this seemingly sinister connection that Barlow has to, what's been going on with the town. But unfortunately, though, even though he's one of the people who, takes, the suspicions, of some of the people, seriously about Barlow, he's investigating both Barlow and Ben Mears because, both guys came into town at the same time. And around that same time, that's when some of these disappearances started happening. And so he's investigating both of them, but he recognizes, though, that there's something off about Straker. And so, he is able to do some research on both Straker and Barlow and doesn't seem to turn up, a whole lot as far as anything sinister, but he knows that there's something up with them. But unfortunately, he finds that, this, plague, gradually makes its way through the town, he is out of his depth. And so, when it comes to, say, anyone being able to stand up against this, this plague, and this monster behind it, it's a group of unlikely people who just happen to have some experience with darkness and tragedy. But I mean, of course, you have Ben Mears, the writer, and you have Susan, his now girlfriend, and then you have her father, Dr. Norton, and basically you also have Mark Petrie, who, even though he doesn't join up with them right away, I mean, he does, end up ultimately crossing paths with them. And of course, you have Jason Burke, the old school teacher, and in the sense that he's kind of like, the Van Helsing of the group, in a sense that he's able to do a lot of research on vampire lore and, give the group kind of a fighting chance. But unfortunately, with this, outbreak going on, I mean, this is something that, they can't just come out and say, hey, we're having a vampire outbreak. They can't just call 911 and say, hey guys, we got some vampires in the town. Can you come help us? I mean, because at this point in time, I mean, no one believes in vampires beyond, say, being a good source of horror fiction. But, they're trying to figure out, okay, how much are we on our own and how much can we, get help? But unfortunately, they can't really get outside help. And so, they're kind of on their own as, more and more of the townspeople either leave town or become vampires. So, all in all, though, I thought that this was a very well done miniseries. And even though it's dated, I mean, the fact that, it for the time had some top-notch production values and some excellent casting, it definitely, made up for the dated aspect. And I think that, as time's gone on, that's one of the reasons why I've been able to, forgive the fact that the miniseries is missing some of the stuff that I liked from the novel. But let's get into, say, what makes the movie work. I mean, I'm sorry, with the miniseries. As I mentioned, you have some excellent casting. I mean, you have, David Soul from, the 70s cop show Starsky and Hutch, which I haven't seen, but I know it was popular back in the day. But from what I understand, Salem's Lot, was kind of an opportunity for David Soul to, show his range as an actor, and showing that he could do stuff other than buddy cop shows. And he does a pretty good job as the writer Ben Mears, and he's someone that you could tell that his character has dealt with some tragedy, but at the same time, he's also gotten used to people sort of belittling his field of occupation, as a writer. And so he kind of takes some stuff in stride, like as far as people being dismissive of him just because he's a writer. But at the same time, though, I mean, when it comes to, say, people he cares about, or people that he respects, I mean, there's a real closeness there that David Soul is able to bring to the part. Whether it's catching up with his former school teacher, Jason Burke, or forming a connection with Susan Norton, or even being kind of a surrogate father eventually to Mark Petrie. I mean, David Soul does a really good job with the part, in a sense that, I mean, he doesn't set out to be a hero or anything like that, but because of his position as a writer and his skills and research and everything, and just also because he happens to be in the quote unquote right place at the right time, he is able to make something of a difference, in the sense that he's one of the people that's able to pose a threat to the plans of Straker and Barlow. And so I thought that David Soul did a good job of playing that sort of unintentional hero, as it were, because I mean, they could have I'm guessing his part on Starsky and Hutch, he must have been like a tough guy or something, but I mean, they could have tapped into that for his character. But the thing is, I mean, as they talk about in the commentary, David Soul was wanting to, I guess, try and expand his range as an actor. And so, the tough guy stuff, that was kind of, thrown aside and, left with Starsky and Hutch. And here you have a guy who, he's just an ordinary writer who, happens to, be in a position where he can make a difference, except unfortunately, this is a situation that is, well beyond his experience, but he does what he can, working with the resources that he has available, and he does his best to try and, look out for the people he comes to care about. So, and I think that, David Soul, he brought this, very human sensibility, to the part, in a sense that he's someone who, I mean, is recovering from trauma and everything, but he also has a deep-seated fear of some horrific stuff that he remembers seeing as a child at the Marston house. And so even though he was initially wanting to rent the Marston house to help him channel his darkness into something productive, it's something that scares the crap out of him. I mean, the idea of just being near the Marston house is ultimately something that proves to be a source of fear for him. And I thought David Soul actually did a good job of showing that, because he does a good job of physically showing how much the fear gets to him. And there's an especially memorable scene where he's left alone in a morgue, or it's a makeshift morgue because it's in a hospital, but there's this one lady who's passed away, from this, mysterious plague that's spreading throughout the town. But Ben and only Ben and a couple other people are, you know, of the notion that this is, the work of a vampire. And so he's temporarily left alone with this woman's body. And, he's trying to make this improvised crucifix with these forceps and some tape, because, they're wanting to see, okay, when the sun goes down, you know, if she, rises up and tries to attack us, okay, we definitely got, a vampire on our hands. And sure enough, I mean, yeah, the lady, once the sun starts to go down, the lady comes back to life. And it's actually a pretty scary scene. And, both, the lady playing, the, formerly deceased woman and who's now a vampire, she does a good job with the part in the sense of, rising up and looking around and everything. And then you have David Soul, just, freaking out and trying to, remember a prayer, and he's praying aloud, and then he's, screaming for help too. And while at the same time trying to make sure his, crucifix is holding together. And that was a pretty scary scene. And I thought that, as far as showing the fear that his character's experiencing, David Soul did a good job of selling it. So, yeah, David Soul did a good job as, the protagonist in the movie. But the scene stealer, though, was the late, great James Mason as Straker. And, James Mason was one of those guys who, he didn't have to be overtly threatening. He could be charming and threatening all at once in the roles that he worked in. And I mean, you look at him in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea or The Boys from Brazil. I mean, the guy was, good at, walking that line between charismatic and threatening. So, and he brings that, to the role of Straker in the sense that, when he first comes into the town and he's, talking to this realtor about, the instructions for bringing the headboard into the basement of the Marsden house. I mean, the way he plays the part, it's like he's someone of royalty or something like that who finds, it beneath him to talk to, peasants, as it were, but, he's having to do so in a sense that, this this is new territory for him. And, he's having to, go through the, proper channels to, get a foothold into town for his vampiric master. So I guess, there is some dark comedy in that respect, in the sense that, this is a guy who you come to find is clearly connected to a source of, pure evil. And if he wanted to, could probably just, make mincemeat of anyone standing in his way. But, he's having to make sure that they get a foothold in the town first. So he kind of has to play the game of, okay, I'm, at the beck and call of, the authorities in this town, something like that. But once Barlow's brought in and they have a foothold, then, you see Straker, start to, ease up a little more. Like he starts to become a little more confident, at least as far as, his outward projection goes. And, because he knows that at this point that, the idea of anyone in the town being able to, recognize the work of a vampire, let alone stand up against a vampire, is laughable. And so, there's even, a moment or two where he has an interaction with Ben Mears, and and usually it's like Ben Mears just kind of, you know, being nervous around the guy. But there is the occasional moment though where, Ben Mears, sort of hints at, the notion that, he has an idea that there's something going on there. Like, there's a point where, Straker and Ben Mears have this sort of, verbal dance with each other at the antique store, because he's asking him about silver. And and it's a rather interesting scene, because on the surface it's not anything dramatic or anything like that, but considering that we know that Straker's working with a vampire, and that Ben Mears is starting to suspect that vampires are responsible for this plague in the town, and he's starting to have suspicions about Straker. There is that bit of suspense regenerated because of that. So but James Mason, though, he just sells the part, because he's disarmingly normal on the surface. Like, he just looks like a elderly gentleman, and acts like an elderly gentleman too, but he's able to have this threatening vibe about him without doing much. Like, he's able to suddenly appear behind someone without them realizing until they turn around, that kind of thing. And some of the lines that he has about Mr. Barlow being eager to meet the people of the town, or the way he says something like that, has this dark, comical vibe, to it, because, it's kind of like an innuendo almost. Because, vampires, they love to meet new people, victims, right? But yeah, James Mason, though, I thought did a wonderful job in the part. And also you had Bonnie Bedelia as Susan Norton. And of course, most people remember her as the wife of Bruce Willis's character, John McClane, in Die Hard. So, but she did pretty good here. And I think that while the book definitely fleshed out the relationship between her and Ben Mears a lot more, I think that they did a good enough job here in the miniseries to where you saw some of the family drama that she had to go through, and you also saw her developing a relationship with Ben Mears too. And she and David Soul, I thought, had good chemistry with one another, and I think that they chose well in having Bonnie Bedelia play the part. And of course, as she starts to get drawn up in, the supernatural, events of the story, much like, the other people in this small group that's aware of the vampires' existence and the threat they represent, she finds herself kind of in over her head, but nonetheless, she's, trying to look out for the people that she cares about. And she realizes that there is a threat here, just, something that she never thought that she'd, be dealing with at all, because who believes in vampires these days? So, but yeah, Bonnie Bedelia, I thought, did a good job in the part that she had. And, Mark Petrie Lance Kerwin as Mark Petrie. I thought he did a pretty good job too. And I think that, they did a good job of, choosing a young actor for the part. And even though, say, in the novel, his physical description's different, they got a lot of the mannerisms, down to where, Mark Petrie on screen, is basically, doing justice to Mark Petrie from the novel. And much like in the novel, there are a couple of moments where Mark Petrie is able to utilize his fascination with horror into an edge against the vampires. Like he automatically knows how they're fearful of crucifixes, and like how you have to have faith to hold up the crucifix against a vampire, things like that. Um, so yeah, I mean, Lance Kerwin, I thought, did a good job in the part, and basically, you're rooting for his character, as he's getting caught up in these nightmarish events. But but you also have Lou Ayres, who he's one of those actors who had been in a lot of things back in the day. I think he was in a movie called Johnny Bedelia, which I never saw, but I've heard it's a classic. And I think he was also on All Quiet on the Western Front, the original movie. And I think he may have even been blacklisted back in the day. The Hollywood blacklist of communists and all that stuff. But he was a good actor, though, and I really liked his character in this particular miniseries. And he just has this old school teacher vibe about him, and they chose the perfect guy for the part. And I thought that he had a good chemistry with David Soul as well. And the scene where the scenes where the two of them are either catching up or talking about I guess more esoteric matters, such as, say, if whether or not they believe that in a house can be inherently evil. And you have this fascinating discussion between the two of them about such matters. And it doesn't come across as nonsensical or gibberish. Like, they really sell the notion that these two characters are seriously talking about this idea. And I thought that Lou Ayres I thought that Lou Ayres was great in the part. And one of the things that I like about his particular character, though, is that they did a good job in choosing someone as old as he was, because in the novel there's a moment or two where he faces off with a vampire, and he's able to drive the vampire away by way of, say, rejecting an invitation that he'd initially given to this one particular character who wasn't a vampire yet, but was in the process of being turned. He just didn't know it. This was before they realized that, yeah, these vampires are real. And so, like, in the book, I mean, he's an old man, and he has the most knowledge in the group, and he is able to drive a vampire away by revoking his invitation, but then, it takes a toll on him, and he has a heart attack. And so that actually carries over into the miniseries. And I think that, there was something eerie, about seeing an elderly actor like Lou Ayres, playing, his character having a heart attack, because it looked very real. And so, so I like that they brought this, character who was already likable in the novel. They brought him to life in this miniseries with such a wonderful actor, and I think that they definitely did the book justice in that regard. But you also have George Dzunda. I hope I'm saying the guy's name right, but he was in The Deer Hunter, first season or so of Law and Order, but he was pretty spooky in this. I mean, not in the way of, say, vampire spooky, but in the way of, say, small town dark skeletons in the closet scary. He's basically a drunkard who beats his wife. But his wife isn't a saint either, in the sense that she's cheating on him. So, yeah, so there's like that small town, domestic abuse, storyline, which the way it's, handled in the miniseries is actually pretty spooky, in the way that he deals with, his wife and her lover. It definitely, leaves a mark as far as, you go away from the miniseries remembering that part, So, And I'm so familiar with George D'Souza being like a more of a playing like friendlier parts. So this is my first time seeing him play a very unhinged individual, and I was like, damn, it's actually pretty good range there. Um, but you also have you know Jeffrey Lewis, who was in a lot of Clint Eastwood movies, including Thunderbolt and Lightfoot. Wonderful character actor. He plays, the character of Mike Ryerson, who works at the local cemetery. And he was also a former student, much like the character of Ben Mears. Mike Ryerson was also a former student of Jason Burke, and so Jeffrey Lewis, though, he's always done a good job of playing characters that are, simple but kind, and that kind of carries over into Mike Ryerson. But since this is a vampire, story, and a lot of people get turned into vampires, Jeffrey Lewis gets to show how scary he can be at a certain point. So, there's an iconic scene from this miniseries where he comes back as a vampire and he's just sitting in this rocking chair. And I mean, that visual itself is scary enough as is, but then he opens his eyes and they're glowing. And of course, they use contacts for that. But then when he's approaching this one particular character, trying to basically hypnotize them, and he has this rasping voice and the movements he has, I was like, damn, Jeffrey Lewis is actually pretty scary here, So yeah, that was actually, a good performance as well. And, of course, Kenneth McMillan as Constable Gillespie. The first time I saw Kenneth McMillan in anything was in, David Lynch's Dune, where he played the, Baron Harkonnen, very grotesque, villain, right? But so seeing him in that, and then in the horror movie Cat's Eye, where he was also a villain, and then seeing him here in Salem's Lot, where he's actually kind of a good guy, it was kind of a surprise for me because I mean, he did have that sort of hard-nosed personality that he tends to just exude, in his roles. But here, though, I mean, he wasn't like a corrupt individual. Like, he was just someone who, was trying to look out for, the people in his town, And so when he's investigating Ben Mears, as well as Straker, I mean, it doesn't come across as, he's doing, something like that just to be a jerk. Like, he's like, okay, both of these guys came into a town at the same time, and at the same time, that's when all these disappearances started happening. So, yeah, I'm going to be suspicious of these two. And so when he's, singling out Ben Mears, I mean, you get the idea that he's doing it because he's genuinely trying to make sure that this guy's, not a threat to the town. And so I liked seeing that. I liked seeing that, I mean, he was suspicious, but he wasn't, say, he wasn't abusing his power, like he was, a good individual who took his responsibilities seriously. But unfortunately, I mean, like, the other people in the group who start to become aware of, the vampire menace, he finds, quite quickly that he's very much in over his head. So I thought that, Kenneth McMillan did a good job of, playing that type of character. And it was a nice change of pace from, say, the usual villainous roles that I'm used to seeing him in. But, the person who plays, Barlow, the vampiric master of Straker, was a guy named Reggie Nalder. And his performance was, it's hard to describe in a sense that he really doesn't do anything in the way of vocals, because in the novel, the character of Barlow was basically, described as this, aristocratic looking, European, gentleman who, you know, was initially shown as an old man, but as he fed on more and more people, his parlor started to, improve, and his and he started to like become like physically, he started to look, healthier. And so he had a lot of dialogue in the novel. But in this miniseries, though, he doesn't have any dialogue. And in fact, I mean, visually speaking, spoiler alert, that's what he looks like in the miniseries versus, say, the more aristocratic appearance that's given to him in the novel. But so he looks like Count Orlok from Nosferatu. And I mean, to be sure, it's a terrifying appearance, right? But he does do a good job when it comes to, say, like the physical department, like when it comes to, say, hovering over someone or looming over someone, or, holding them hostage, or threatening to rip out their throat with his claws. I mean, or just like when he, pops out at someone and there's this, terrifying fanged visage, just, confronting you, like, you're looking at the screen and you're trying to find, what made that sound, and then suddenly, poof, there's this, terrifying, fanged face with, yellow glowing eyes looking right at you. I mean, yeah, so they actually did a pretty good job of making, Barlow scary in his own way in the miniseries, in a physical sense. And I thought that Reggie Nalder, did a good job in the physical mannerisms of the character. But I do wish that they had kept, some of the dialogue from the novel and given it to him, But I think what happened was, and don't quote me on this, but I think what happened was, like, some of the makeup may have, made it difficult for Reggie Nalder to, say the lines or something like that. That may have been part of it, and some of it could have been, for the sake of time. They instead gave, some of the dialogue that Barlow had in the novel, and they gave it to Straker. But when that dialogue's coming from James Mason, you better believe it's scary. So it's a good trade-off, So, you got Barlow, looking more physically terrifying, or I should say being more physically terrifying. And then you have, Straker, as played by James Mason, just being more terrifying. So, so it is a trade-off, and I do think that there are some instances where, Straker gets, the lion's share of, the scares in the movie, or just, being a source of fear in the movie. Whereas Barlow, while he looks terrifying and at times is terrifying, because there's not a lot of time given to his character, he's not as terrifying as he could have been. And in fact, like when it comes to, say, the final confrontation between, the dwindling group, of, heroes, as it were, versus, Barlow, I mean, the Barlow in the books, was a lot more dangerous when it comes to, say, the final confrontation. Whereas here, I mean, while it's still very suspenseful, he's taken out a lot easier, so so that kind of leads into the whole thing of, it was kind of a drawback because they, even though they were able to cover more ground with a miniseries than they would have a movie, they left a lot of stuff out that I think would have, added to, say, further character development, or just, made the proceedings, more spooky. But then again, if they had tried to, I guess, make it as, dark as, the novel was, it may have been too much for network television, because you read the novel, it's like an R-rated movie, so they understandably had to leave some stuff out, or at the very least, imply something as opposed to, say, outright show it, things like that. So the special effects, I think, were good for their time. Um, and like some of the imagery of like the vampires floating outside of someone's window at night, um, you could tell that even though you can't see any strings, you can tell that there's something, um, there's some sort of process that's taken place behind the actors playing the vampires that's making it look like they're floating and what have you. And so I mean it's a good special effects sequence whenever you're seeing a vampire float outside someone's window. And for the most part, I thought that they did a good job with the vampiric makeup of the people who had been turned into vampires, because like they're they have pale skin and glowing eyes, um, and so definitely an eerie appearance. And with a couple of them, you know, it's one of those things where you definitely see some vampires in action in this miniseries, but unfortunately, with the novel, you saw them do a lot more. Whereas here, though, the vampires we do see in action, we do get some good set pieces, but a lot of the other stuff, it takes place off camera, and there's a lot of implication and things like that. And so, and also this was 1979, and I imagine that special effects wise, maybe they only had enough of a budget for a certain amount of people to be in vampire makeup and doing vampire things, right? So like there is a moment or two where, like, in the scene where Ben Mears is left alone with the dead body, and it's starting to come back to life. I mean, it's a scary scene and everything, but on the downside, though, when he uses his makeshift crucifix on her, she screams and everything and clearly gets burned by the crucifix, but then she just, poof, vanishes. And so, I mean, that part, I mean, it was kind of laughable. I mean, as far as special effects go. I mean, but then again, you compare that to the, early 2000s movie adaptation where Rob Lowe was Ben Mears, and you have the same scene, and you get this, obviously, CGI, Matrix wall crawling, thing, and then the vampire vanishes. So I guess, I mean, the same scene in this miniseries, even though the special effects were kind of dated, I mean, and it was kind of lame to just have her, vanish and like poof, just like that. I think that overall that was probably better than what was shown in the, 2000s, movie adaptation. So it was definitely a lot scarier here, though. So I guess, bearing in mind this is 1979, you can kind of forgive some of the special effects, for being dated, or, because they were working with, network television resources, they could only do so much for special effects at the time. But yeah, so even though we don't see like, the vampires in action a whole lot, when we do see them in action, it tends to be pretty spooky. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, Jeffrey Lewis, when his character gets vampirized, that part was terrifying. So, but on the other hand, there are certain characters that were present in the novel, but either aren't present here or their parts are very much underwritten. Like the character of Father Callahan was a major character in the novel, but he's basically reduced to a cameo here, where he basically has a face-off with Barlow and Straker, and while in the novel it was just in the same scene it was him and Barlow facing off with each other, for the life of one of the characters. And there's like a contest of wills, between the two, in a sense that Father Callahan is being challenged by Barlow to, face him with his faith, and well, let's just say that the character in the novels, at a very disillusioned point in his life, so his faith was already, shaky at best, but when he's being faced, with, a straight up vampire, I mean, it's something that proves to be too much for him, and it doesn't end well for his character. So you have that scene in the miniseries, but because Father Callahan basically just shows up in what's essentially a cameo appearance, we don't really have time to, get to know his character. And so, when he has that, little showdown with Barlow and, this time Straker, because they're giving Barlow's dialogue to Straker, through James Mason. I mean, it's more memorable for James Mason's line delivery than anything the character Father Callahan does, because, he's just kind of there, and he's not in the movie long enough, or the miniseries long enough, to really make an impression or have us care about him, whereas we actually have come to care about the main characters. So and also the character of Dr. Bill Norton, as played by Ed Flanders. I thought that Ed Flanders did a really good job with the part. He was in the TV show Saint Elsewhere, which I haven't seen, but I know he was in there. But I know he was also in Exorcist 3 Legion, and I did see that, and he was good in that. But Ed Flanders, though, I liked how, he played his part, in a sense that, he's, a father who, clearly, cares about his daughter and her well-being, but at the same time, once he's vetted, Ben, and realizes that, hey, this is a good dude, he's willing to, basically trust his daughter to, live her own life, and have her own, experiences and what have you, outside of, the helicopter parenting that he and his wife, may have done, but and also just his, friendship with Ben Mears, and how the two of them come to work together with this, vampiric situation, and him having to confront this head on from a medical standpoint. I mean, you definitely see the mounting dread, that his character is experiencing, as Ed Flanders, does a good job of, depicting that. The one downside with his character is that his character in the miniseries is actually a combination of, two characters from the novel. So if you haven't read the novel, it's probably not going to be that much big of a deal. But if you have read the novel and then you watch the miniseries, you'll see where certain actions that his character takes may have, been taken by someone else in the novel, or certain things that happened to his character in the miniseries may have happened to someone else in the novel, things like that. So, like I said, if you've read the novel, that's probably the only way it's going to be a pet peeve for you. But if you haven't, it's not that big of a deal. But like the one other downside I could say is that, when they do the ending, I understand why they, went with the ending that they did and the way it was done, but there's a character that comes back, as a vampire to, hunt down the survivors, because the whole idea is, the main characters that survive this whole experience have been on the run from the vampires, since, Salem's Lot. And so at the end, there's a character that comes back who is turned into a vampire and has, been trying to hunt them down. And it's emotionally speaking, it's, a sad scene. But then when you see this character open their mouths and you see the fangs, it just kind of looks fake, unfortunately. And so, which is a bummer, because up until that point, I thought that they had done a good job of, making the vampires actually look like vampires and look threatening and scary and what have you. So, So I did think that, like, the ending itself wasn't bad. I just think that, maybe if they had done something different with the makeup, like, that might have been better. But yeah, I will say though, like, as far as suspense, this movie, this miniseries actually does a very good job of maintaining it. Whether it be the scene where these two truck drivers are transporting the headboard to the basement of the Marston house, and some creepy things start happening with the truck, or whether it be the aforementioned scene where George Dzunda's character confronts his car horn. But anyway, or the scene where George Dzunda confronts his cheating wife and her lover with a shotgun. I mean, that scene was terrifying as well, just because of how, down to earth and, close to home it is, right? But then, of course, when you have, the scenes of, the vampires, floating outside, certain characters' windows, and, just, the ethereal, imagery of the vampires, floating and, calling, the characters' names and what have you, some pretty creepy stuff. And of course, when you get to the, the aforementioned scene where, Ben Mears and Dr. Norton are testing, their theory about, vampires, being real. I mean, in that, makeshift, morgue. I mean, that was a terrifying, set piece as well. But then, of course, I mean, for straight up suspense, though, I mean, when you have certain characters, towards the climax of the movie, breaking into the Marston house, and you see how dilapidated it is on the inside, and the way the camera work is, you see it pull back at times, and you see like the dust motes floating, and so some remarkable imagery which just add to the dread of the situation. But of course, at the climax, when the when the survivors, or the last few people in the group that are still alive, are confronting Barlow, where his coffin's hidden. It's a pretty terrifying set piece in the sense that they've already been trying to find where his coffin is, and they do find it, but then at that point the sun's starting to go down, and all around them there are these other people who have been turned into vampires that were sleeping, and they're starting to wake up, and you see them start to crawl and bring themselves ever so closer to the surviving characters who are trying to get into Barlow's coffin. And it's a pretty terrifying sequence and very, very suspenseful. So I'm gonna go ahead and give Salem's Lot. I'm gonna go ahead and give Salem's Lot 4 out of 5 stars. This was a good miniseries. I mean, dated in some ways, but I mean, at the same time, it definitely stands on its own as being, a good piece of, vampire fiction. And I thought that it did a good job of not only being its own thing, but a fairly faithful adaptation to the Stephen King novel. Even though it left some things out, I mean, it got enough right to where it did the novel justice, in my opinion. So, as far as special features go, there's only 2. There's an international theatrical trailer, and a feature-length audio commentary by director Tobe Hooper. But on the plus side, though, the audio commentary by Tobe Hooper is amazing. And it's really strange listening to him talk when you know that, the guy is, passed away a few years ago. But so it was kind of like, you're listening to a ghost, recount some, memories of, a special time in his life, because, as Tobe Hooper, as he talks about the movie, it's just him talking. Like, there's no one else in the commentary track. It's just him. But it's like this storyteller, who happens to be a ghost or something, just, reminiscing about, how the movie came, I'm sorry, how the miniseries came to be and how he came to be attached to it. And one of the things that I learned from the commentary, as well as looking at up stuff about behind the scenes stuff online, was that George Romero was in talks to direct Salem's Lot back when they were trying to do it as a movie, but he bailed when when they decided to change it to a mini series. And so that was one of the other things that allowed for Tobe Hooper to be available to direct Salem's Lot. So and when he's talking about it, I mean, he talks about how a lot of the areas where they shot, I mean, they used real houses and everything and like a real town. And also that, I mean, there was some set dressing involved and what have you, but for the most part, they tried to, shoot in areas that were, real. But then also, when he was talking about like what it was like working with some of the actors, he was very complimentary of, David Soul, in the sense that he talks about how David Soul was basically trying to flex his acting muscles, and and he thought that he turned in a good performance, but he was very complimentary towards James Mason, and he praises the guy for managing to be classy and scary at the same time without raising his voice. And so he said that one of the highlights of his careers and one of the biggest honors he's had throughout his career was being able to work with James Mason in this miniseries. And so and he talks about how just about everyone that he worked with on the miniseries, they all worked well together, and basically for the most part everyone got along. And so it's nice to find out stuff like that. but no, I just he had some good stories to tell about the whole experience of making the Salem's Lot miniseries, and it's funny because you could tell that it was something that he was proud of, but at times he kind of, you get the idea that he's looking back at while watching this and doing a commentary and wishing that maybe he had taken some of the lessons he'd learned from this and applied it to some of his other stuff, because this is definitely one of the best things that Tobe Hooper's done as a director. Of course, he's also working with a good screenplay by Paul Monash, and he's also got a good cast that he's working with too. But I mean, this is definitely one of the best works that he's done, and I would argue it's probably his most mainstream friendly as well. And I think that there are a couple times in the commentary track where there is that vibe that while he's reminiscing about things, he's recounting some of the lessons that he learned, and maybe if he had taken a similar approach that he took with Salem's Lot with some of his other work, maybe his career would have been his career may have gone a different direction, that kind of thing. Like, maybe, his movies might have been more of a hit with mainstream audiences or something like that. But overall, though, I mean, I thought that it was a really nice commentary track. And even though, like, the miniseries itself is 3 hours long, and so, the commentary track covers all that, it's not boring at all, and you learn a lot about the miniseries as well as about Tobe Hooper himself as he talks about his experience with working on Salem's Lot. And it's nice to get a commentary track where the director was clearly proud of his work on the movie, and it's something that clearly holds a place in Tobe Hooper's heart. And so it's not like he's dreading talking about it, or he's reluctant to talk about it or anything like that. It's more like, hey, this is something I enjoy doing and I'm happy to talk about, so but yeah, that, like I said, it was kind of like listening to a ghost talk about things, in the sense that Tobe Hooper sadly passed away a couple of years ago. So but yeah, this was definitely one of his good ones. So Salem's Lot, 4 out of 5 stars. So if you made it this far, thank you very much for taking the time to check out my review. And you got any questions, comments, please drop a line, let me know. If anyone's got any other Salem's Lot or Stephen King or, Tobe Hooper tidbits, I'd love to hear them. So y'all take care. Have a good night. Bye.